So here I'm going to go over the different layers of the scalp. So the scalp is composed of 5 different layers, right? That's how we get to the brain or to the skull. And it's the green region, blue region, purple, light blue, and brown. So what is the scalp? The scalp is skin and subcutaneous tissue, right? Composing of connective tissue and muscles covering the neurocranium. Okay? So the first layer is the skin. The second layer is going to be connective tissue. The third layer is going to be called the apnerosis. The fourth layer is loose connective tissue. And the fifth layer is the pericranium. Okay, how are we going to remember this? So, scalp, the word itself, is going to be our acronym or mnemonic that we're going to use. Okay, SCALP. S is for skin, C connective tissue, A for apnerosis, L for loose connective tissue, P for pericranium. Easy enough. Okay, so the first layer, I have it in green, right? This is the skin. The skin contains sweat glands and sebaceous glands. Okay, so it's the outermost region. It's where our sweat and sebaceous glands are. However, if our sebaceous gland, right, if there's a block, that means there's fluid retention. What happens if we have fluid retention in our sweat glands or in our sebaceous gland? We're going to get a cyst. This cyst is known as Wens. Wens is the disorder we're going to have if we have a inhibited sebaceous gland or a defective sebaceous gland. Now, connective tissue, second layer, right? Connective tissue is composed of dense cutaneous tissue. It's nerves and arteries. Okay, so this is a very, very important layer. This layer has most of the nerves and arteries around our outer region of our skull. This is where it all is. Okay. There's a lot of blood vessels that form lots of anamostoses, right? Anastomoses, I'm sorry. What are anastomoses? Was the connections, right? Okay. If you were to get a cut here, right? In like this layer of your scalp and you were unconscious, you're going to bleed to death. Why are you going to bleed to death? Your arteries don't retract in this region. So you're just going to keep flowing and flowing out blood. It's never going to heal. Unless you get it sutured, iced, etc., right? It's not going to heal on its own. Now, the next layer is layer 3. I have it in purple. It's called the apnerosis. What is interesting about the apnerosis? So we have a pink region here and a pink region here, right? I have these as their muscles, right? We have the Frontalis muscle and the Occipitalis muscle. What do these do? Okay, so the Frontalis muscle elevates the eyebrows, right? It helps pull the eyebrows up. It also pulls your front of your skin down, right? And it causes like wrinkles, like a wrinkling, I can't do it, but a wrinkling sensation in your forehead. This is from the Frontalis muscle. The Occipitalis muscle is in the back of your skull, right? And it pulls your muscles back. In between them, so this purple region is going to be called the apnerosis. Okay, so the Frontalis and the Occipitalis hold the apnerosis together and they pull it on either sides. Now, if you were to have a laceration or a cut in this apnerosis, what's going to happen? The wound is going to open up very, very large. Why very large? Because the Frontalis muscle is going to snap down this way, the Occipitalis is going to snap down this way, and they don't have an apnerosis holding them from splitting apart a lot. So this apnerosis is going to spread out a lot. Okay, this is going to be a gaping wound. Now, the next layer is this ocean blue layer, right? This is called loose connective. These colors are not on our brain or on our skin. I just drew different colors to differentiate it. So the ocean blue color is the loose connective tissue. This is known as the danger zone. Why is this the danger zone? Okay, this is the danger zone is because if you see in this loose connective tissue, I have this little purple structure. This is called the mesenteric artery. Or, I'm sorry, the emissary veins. The emissary veins are in this connective tissue. What does that mean? These emissary veins, right, they travel to the parietal foramen, which then goes to the veins in the skull, down to the superficial veins of the scalp, into the dural venous sinuses, down into, they're going to carry an infection, right? Retrograde formation, so from outside to in, anterograde is inside to out. Down, retrograde formation into the septic thrombi. So you're going to get infections in your skull if you have a cut in this region. Okay? What type of what could be damaged, like what could be bad here. So you could have an infection called as meningitis. This comes from this region. It's a buildup of pus and stuff in this region going right to your brain. Okay, the fifth layer. Actually, one more thing I want to talk about this layer. See, the frontalis muscle is right underneath it. So if you have a black eye, right, in your pre-orbital, it's called pre-orbital ecchymosis. It's a black eye. So you have blood that rushes underneath your skin, right? And the blood is going to pool into the frontalis region by your eye. So since you don't have a lot of bony structures near your eye, the blood is just going to be able to swell up or pool up and form a black eye. Now, what's going to happen next? Apnerosis, layer 5, the deepest one, right? No. I said apnerosis already. Pericranium, right? The deepest one. Apnerosis was layer 3. Pericranium is layer 5. Okay, this is also known as perosteum. We said perosteum was the surface that covers the outside of bones, right? It's the same thing but for the skull. It's closely attached to the skull. Now, what happens if there's a rupture in this region? Okay, so you could have Cephalo Hematoma, which is when a baby is being born, there's a little damage, right? It's temporary bleeding from the perosteum arteries, usually the parietal bone, so usually over here, right? Temporary bleeding, they're going to cause like a little like swelling of their brain. And it's going to heal. It's just, this is a disorder that you could see with this region. So one other thing I want to discuss is the facial nerve. The facial nerve comes from the pons, right? And it's the chief motor nerve of the face. This facial nerve is cranial nerve 7, and it innervates the frontalis and the occipitalis. The temporal branch is the frontalis, and the posterior auricular nerve is the occipitalis. The frontalis, right, elevates the eyebrows and the transverse wrinkles in the forehead when frowning, like we said. The occipitalis now, he's going to pull the scalp posteriorly, so backwards, and wrinkle skin on the posterior surface of the neck. Okay, so you're going to have wrinkles in your neck without him. Also, if you have an inhibited frontalis, if you are diagnosing a patient, you could do this test, and if they have an inhibited frontalis, they can like scrunch down their frontal region, in the frontalis, they're going to be diagnosed with frontal nerve palsy, or facial nerve palsy. So that's basically it for the scalp region, and yeah. Okay, so this is the arteries now of the scalp and the face region. Okay, so one thing I want to go over is that all these arteries are coming from the second layer of the scalp. So they're coming from the connective tissue region. They're not coming from we're not talking about the arteries on the internal side. Okay, what does this mean? So the common carotid artery, right, comes up through the neck and it bifurcates into two arteries. The external carotid and the internal carotid. Okay, so one thing to mention. The external carotid is usually, or is, for the outside cranial cavity. So the external carotid now is going to be for the second layer of my scalp, the connective tissue layer. The internal carotid artery is supposed to be for the inside cranial cavity, right? It's supposed to be for the deeper layers, like in the brain and stuff. However, for these arteries that I'm talking about, the internal carotid has two separate arteries, right? That branches off and it covers the external cranial cavity. What are they? Okay, so the internal carotid, right? It's deep inside the brain. However, the two arteries come out through the carotid canal and we're up above the eye, right? They're above the eye region. These arteries are called the supraorbital artery and the supratrochlear artery. Supraorbital artery is a little more medial, and then is a little more lateral, and the supratrochlear artery is a little more medial. What does this mean? That means the supraorbital is for the lateral portion of the eye, and the supratrochlear is going to be for the medial portion of the eye. Okay, if these arteries keep going, you could see that they fuse with another artery. What's the other artery? If we come down again, we have the common carotid artery, comes up through the external carotid, right? Bifurcates, right? Internal carotid, external carotid. This external carotid is going to deviate into three different branches. It's going to deviate into more, but however, we're only talking about the outside connective tissue right now. Okay, he's going to go to the occipital artery. So this is posterior now. So let me draw this line right down the middle, right? This line is deviating anterior to posterior. Okay, So the external carotid, right, goes to the posterior side for our occipital artery, and it also goes to the posterior or auricular. What is auricular? So auricular, auricle means the ear. So posterior auricular is going to be the posterior side of the ear, back of the ear. Okay, the external carotid artery also comes up and then fuses to an artery in the anterior division of the scalp. So this is the posterior, this is the anterior. The anterior is the superficial temporal artery. Okay, now, what did I say? The external carotid goes to the superficial temporal, and the internal carotid goes to the supratrochlear or the supraorbital. These arteries, what do? They anastomose, they fuse together in the anterior region. So if we have an anastomosis, that means the fusion of arteries. Also, the external carotid artery, right, comes up over here in the posterior region, and he forms the occipital, or he forms posterior auricular. These arteries also anastomose together. So this is basically how the blood flows to the second layer of the scalp, to connective tissue region, and supplies blood to this area of the head. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the veins and how venous drainage comes back to our body. So remember, we're talking about the second layer, the connective tissue in the scalp, right? So it's the connective tissue layer, so it's the second layer. And I'm going to do the flow chart first. I'll do them both kind of together to make things easier. So we're going to start on the anterior side. Remember, we have anterior and posterior. Anterior is the side from, so if you take the auricle, right, and you split it right down the middle, so my ears, and if I hold my top of my ears, I'm going to go around like this. That's how I'm going to deviate between anterior and posterior. Okay, so the anterior side, if we remember from the arteries, we had supratrochlear arteries and supraorbital arteries. Well, same thing. We're going to have a supratrochlear vein and a supraorbital vein. These two veins are going to fuse together, and they're going to be called the angular vein. So right here, we have supratrochlear, supraorbital, fusing together to form the angular vein. This angular vein is going to continue down, and it's going to be known as the facial vein. So right here, supraorbital, supratrochlear, goes to the angular vein, continues down, and it's known as the facial vein. Okay, now, we also have, if you remember on the posterior side, we have a superficial temporal vein, we have a posterior auricular vein, right? Okay, so the first side is going to be the superficial temporal vein. He's going to fuse together with something called as the maxillary vein. So right here we have superficial temporal, maxillary, fusing together, and they're going to form the retromandibular vein. Okay, right here is going to be the retromandibular vein. We have superficial, temporal, and maxillary fusing together, forming retromandibular. Good. Now, this retromandibular vein is going to divide into two different veins. It's going to bifurcate. It's going to go to the posterior division, so posterior side, and anterior division, anterior side, right? So first, the posterior side, posterior division, he's going to fuse with the posterior auricular vein. Okay, so retromandibular to posterior, and now posterior auricular, they fuse together, and they form the external jugular vein. Okay, the external jugular vein is going to be right over here. He's going to come down, right, and he's going to fuse with something called the subclavian vein. Remember, we had subclavian veins in the arms and above the shoulders? So they're just going to fuse together. So external jugular and subclavian are going to fuse together. Now, we have the anterior side again. We have supratrochlear, supraorbital, fusing to form the angular vein. Angular vein comes to the facial vein, right? Now we also had retromandibular going to posterior anterior. The anterior side is going to fuse together and form the common facial vein. So let's look at it. Posterior side, right? Retromandibular. This is the anterior side, but this is a different branch. So superficial temporal maxillary forms retromandibular. They're going to form posterior anterior. Anterior is going to fuse together with the facial vein from the supratrochlear and supraorbital, right? The facial vein and anterior division of retromandibular are going to fuse together and form the common facial vein. This common facial vein now is going to fuse together with the internal jugular vein. Okay, so now when we have the external jugular vein, subclavian vein, fusing together, and the common facial vein and the internal jugular vein fusing together, we're going to form the brachiocephalic vein. So all of these arteries, all of these veins are going to fuse together and form the brachiocephalic vein. This brachiocephalic vein is then going to flow into the superior vena cava, which is one of the vena cavas. We have an inferior and superior. The superior one is going to go to the right atrium, like directly from above, right into the right atrium of our heart. This is how blood's going to go back to our body. Okay, so let's look at it. External jugular and subclavian fusing together, right? Common facial and internal jugular fusing together. All of these, when they are all fused together, they form the brachiocephalic. This brachiocephalic then fuses into the superior vena cava. So this is the veins of the face. Okay, so this right here is the dangerous area of the face. This is the upper lip. It's kind of like a triangle, but like I have a 2D image, so it would be the upper lip region, right? And it would form a triangle right to the top of my nose, right here. So right down here to here is called the dangerous area of the face. Why is this a dangerous area of the face? Okay, so we have a sinus called the cavernous sinus, right? Located right behind us, right? Inside of our skull, or inside of our head, right behind the eye, right? And it gets supply from the facial vein, or the superior ophthalmic veins, right? And where are these veins located? These veins are located by the upper lip, the nostril, and near the eye. So, this cavernous sinus, however, it goes to deep tissues. It travels to the brain. So, if you have a infection, a disease, a bacteria, etc., right, that comes to the body near this dangerous area of the face, it could travel through these ophthalmic veins and it could go into the cavernous sinus. This cavernous sinus will then put it in the body. You could lead to like crazy diseases such as meningitis or like bad bacterial infections, virus infections, etc. This is why this is known as the dangerous area of the face. Okay, so this is going to be the nerves of the face. So, two things to talk about before I get going. Remember, we have to break the face down into an anterior side, right, and a posterior side. So the anterior side is going to be mainly supplied by the cranial nerves. And we're going to do cranial nerve. The facial cranial nerve is for motor supply. And then the trigeminal nerve is going to be for sensory supply. Okay, the main thing to talk about is that we're going to talk about sensory supply. Which ones? So the trigeminal nerve branches into 3 different regions. He branches into the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. So to represent each of them, they're represented by letters, and letter and number code. So ophthalmic is represented by V1, maxillary is represented by V2, and mandibular is represented by V3. So if someone says the nerve regions that's damaged is the V2 region, what nerve is this? We have to know it's a cranial nerve from trigeminal, but it's the maxillary branch of that. So it's the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve would be V2. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about it. So the top region right here, it's shaded in purple, right? This is the ophthalmic region. So V1 is ophthalmic, trigeminal, V1, ophthalmic branch is this top region. The 2 nerves that it's going to supply is the supratrochlear nerve and the supraorbital nerve. Remember, we have a supratrochlear vein and a supratrochlear artery and a supraorbital vein and a supraorbital artery. Well, now we have supratrochlear nerve and supraorbital nerve. Okay, so these nerves are supplied into the ophthalmic region. Now, the next region we have is V2, maxillary. So V2 is trigeminal, maxillary branch, right? And it's like right behind the eye, the nose region to the upper lip. What is he going to supply? He's going to supply the zygomatic temporal nerve. Okay, so zygomatic temporal nerve is from V2, maxillary. Now, the next region we have is from the end part of the anterior side of the ear to the bottom part of the anterior side of the ear. So anterior, medial technically, to posterior medial of the anterior side. So this region is going to be V3, and it's going to do the auriculotemporal nerve. So auriculotemporal nerve is going to be in this region. And what region is this? It's the mandibular region. So V3 is the mandibular region. Now, if we go to the posterior side of the scalp, right? We have in the posterior side, So if we break the posterior side down, right? This is split in half. We have a posterior side and an anterior side. Even though this anterior side is called anterior, it's still in the posterior region of the skull. Because if we just draw this line straight down, that's how it goes. Anterior, posterior. But now we have an anterior side in the posterior region. Okay, so first, the posterior side is going to go to the posterior rami. Okay, he's going to have a third occipital nerve, and he's going to have a greater occipital nerve. Right? This is coming from where? The cervical plexus, or the cervical nerves. It's not coming from a cranial nerve. The anterior rami is going to innervate, or it's going to be the lesser occipital nerve and the greater auricular nerve. So what do I mean by posterior rami and anterior rami? So if we look at this, remember the spinal column? This is like a cross-sectional view. If this is the cervical, so it would be the C2 spine is where these nerves are going to come from. We have to remember we have a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus, right? So the dorsal ramus comes from the what? Dorsal side or posterior, back. And the ventral ramus is the anterior side or front, right? Ventral for front. Okay, so all of the nerves that are coming from the posterior rami, which we said was the third occipital. So third occipital and greater. Right? What was the greater one? Greater occipital. He's coming through the dorsal ramus. Now, all the nerves that are coming through the ventral ramus, right, are coming from the anterior rami. This is going to be the lesser occipital. The lesser occipital. And he's going to be the great auricular. The great auricular. He's going to go through the ventral ramus. But he's not going to go through the whole ventral ramus. Remember that the dorsal ramus and ventral ramus meet before they split again? So when they meet, they're going to go through the dorsal ramus side. So the anterior rami is going to go through the ventral ramus, but go through the dorsal ramus root. The greater occipital and the third occipital comes from the posterior rami, and it's going to go through the dorsal ramus, and it's going to go through the dorsal ramus root into the spine. So that's everything about the nerves of the face. Okay, so this is the lymphatic drainage of the face. So we have three areas. We have the anterior, or the upper area, intermediate area, and lower area. The upper area is coming from here to like the top of the eye region, and it's going to be anterior to the ear. So it's going to be called pre-auricular. What does pre-auricular mean? It means anterior to the ear. So this whole region is going to be lymphatic drainage of the upper area. Now the submandibular region, right? It's going to have the submandibular gland. So this is going to be the submandibular drainage, and it's going to be the intermediate area, right? Here's the upper area. This is the intermediate area, and now we have the lower area. Lower area is going to be submental limbs, right? And what does submental mean? Submental is just two mandibular joints forming together, which is why it's on the lower chin to the lip, right? So that's just the three different areas. Upper area, intermediate, lower. Upper is pre-auricular, intermediate is submandibular, and then lower is submental. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the face with the nerves and the muscles. So if we see here, this is the face again, right? This is going to be the mandible, the maxilla, this is the parotid gland, this is the ear, this is the eye, the nose, nostril. Okay, so the first muscle I want to talk about is going to be the Obicularis Orbital, right? So this muscle goes around the entire eye, right? But it's broken into three different parts. So the first part is going to be the orbital part. I know this is 2D, so it's hard to see, so I'll do it with my face too. The orbital part is going to be the most medial part of the eye. And he's going to be on either side, like of the nose. And what is he going to do? He's going to close the eye very tightly. So he's tight closing of the eye. The next one is the lacrimal. It's also kind of on the medial side, and this is going to hold a teardrop. So it's going to hold you from crying or from tearing. The next one, the third one, is palpebral, or the palpebral part, right? Palpebral part. This gently closes the eye. So where is he located? So he originates from the medial side over here, but he innervates to the lateral side. So he goes from medial to lateral. And he's just going to help you gently close the eye. So now, before we talk about the muscles, I just want to talk about a couple of the nerves. So the whole face is really innervated by the cranial nerve, the facial nerve. We have a couple innervations from the trigeminal nerve, but the main ones I want to focus on is the facial nerve. So the facial nerve travels through and enters through the parotid gland, right? When it goes through the parotid gland, it deviates into 5 different branches. It's going to deviate into the temporal, which is also known as the pes anserinatus, the zygomatic, the buccal, the marginal mandibular, or the cervical branch. Okay, the temporal branch is going to be used for the temple. The zygomatic is going to be used for the zygomatic arch. The buccal nerve is for the cheek. The marginal mandibular is for the mandible. And the cervical branch is going to be used for the platysma. So what is the platysma? This one is the one that comes from the neck. So this is the only nerve that travels down towards the neck. The platysma is like the most superficial muscle on the neck of your skin. And it stretches when you're stressed, really. It helps with breathing, etc. Okay, so that's going to be the platysma. Now, the Bucinator, right? This is the next muscle I have. He's going to help with chewing, blowing, and whistling, right? So he's going to be located over here, and he's associated with Bell's palsy. He really traveled all the way up, but I didn't want to cross over all the structures. So what is Bell's palsy? So we have 2 different types. The one we're going to talk about is Infra-Nuclear Palsy, right? Bell's palsy is called, and it's damage to the facial nerve. Because we know the Bucinator comes from the facial nerve from the buccal branch, correct? Okay, so if you damage the facial nerve, what are we going to have? We're going to have an inability to chew, smile, speech, absence of the transverse wrinkles like on the frontal bone of our head. So how can this happen? So we could have a couple different reasons. We could have a tumor, a parotid tumor. So if we have a tumor in this gland, right, these nerve innervations are going to be destroyed. We could also have an extreme cold or an ear infection, right? So if you see here, if we have an ear infection, this could get all disrupted and all these nerves could be damaged. If we're exposed to extreme cold instantly, all the facial nerves can be like damaged or shocked, etc. Okay, so now that's Bell's palsy. What else could we talk about? Okay, so you see how I have the cranial nerve 5, right? Trigeminal. Remember, trigeminal nerve branches into 3 different things. He branches into the ophthalmic, maxillary, or mandibular. V1, V2, or V3. Where do we get V1, V2, or V3 from? So trigeminal, right, is cranial nerve 5. In Roman numerals, 5 is the letter V. So V1 is cranial nerve 5, but the 1 represents ophthalmic. V2, cranial nerve 5, V2 is maxillary. And then V3 is cranial nerve 5, mandibular. Okay, so the main one we're going to talk about is mandibular. Ophthalmic and the maxillary are mainly for senses. So mandibular it's also for senses, but it's a mixed nerve. What does that mean? It could have sensory or motor innervation. The motor innervation is for massification. Okay, and it has 2 different parts. It has an anterior region, which is going to be the masseteric nerve, right? Or it has a posterior region. It's going to be the auriculotemporal nerve. And these 2 nerves are going to go to the temporomandibular joint. Remember I mentioned before that the auriculotemporal nerve goes to the parotid gland, right, and helps with salivary stimulation? Well, it's the same thing, but now it's going to go to the temporomandibular joint. What is he going to do? He's going to innervate, or the mandibular is going to innervate a couple muscles. What are those muscles? We said the muscles of massification. So what are some of them? We have temporalis, medial or lateral pterygoid, or the masseter. The temporalis has lateral fibers and it has posterior fibers. The lateral fibers are going to close the mouth. The posterior fibers are going to do retrusion of the mouth. Okay, the medial and lateral pterygoid gland, muscles are going to help with grinding of your mouth. So like going to side movements to help chew and break down food. The masseter is also going to help you close the jaw. Okay, so now, what happens if we have a fracture of the temporomandibular joint? So if you're yawning, or like if you're eating something and you have a dislocation of this temporomandibular joint right here, temporal bone and mandible, right? This is where the joint forms. If you have a dislocation there, your mouth's not going to be able to close. Why? because the temporal mandibular joint, the nerves that innervate it, right, are going to be damaged as well. And what's that going to do? They're going to stretch these nerves, so it's going to stretch the anterior and posterior nerves from the mandibular division, so the masseteric and auriculotemporal. And if these nerves are constantly stretched, then these muscles are not going to be able to function. So your mouth's going to be constantly open. This is very painful because these muscles cannot contract, and these nerves are constantly stretched. So that's basically all you guys need to know about the face.